have in turn led to a debate and to a demand for what I like to call deeper integration. And we can understand that deeper integration as being driven by two sets of demands. The one set are functional. If you are Boeing and you want to build your aircraft in all of the different countries that are shown on this slide, there's a whole set of governance demands that you are going to make in order to enable you to operate the chain. And indeed, if you are a country that wants to attract those supply chains, you need to provide those governance demands. And I just list a few of them here. You'd like common standards, you'd like protection for investors, you'd like regulatory coherence, you'd like your intellectual property protected, you'd like the customs to be efficient, you'd like reliable contract enforcement. These are all things that would come quite naturally if you wanted to operate one of these supply chains. Now, also, I'm sorry, getting carried away here. Now, some developing countries have actually been willing to supply these governance mechanisms, but not through the World Trade Organization, at which many efforts for deeper integration are thwarted by the need to get consensus, but rather in regional agreements. And so really, one major contribution of those regional agreements has been to form coalitions of the willing. Those who have been prepared to reform their governance systems so that they can be operational when it comes to these global supply chains. And that's why we've seen, I believe, deep regional agreements flourish. At the same time, it's not many other countries have felt that this is inappropriate for them. They've valued, firstly, a lot of them have had rather adverse experiences with globalization, colonialism, and other vestiges of history have left a legacy. And then there are countries who feel that they'd like to maintain their own policy space, that they would prefer to regulate their firms to a greater degree than the rules might permit under a deep integration agreement. Also, some want to have state-owned enterprises and active industrial policies. And in others, protectionist forces are powerful. So we have diversity in the global economy, with the willing negotiating these deeper agreements, some of the unwilling actually negotiating symbolic agreements, and it being very, very difficult to make progress at the multilateral level because of these differences among the countries. Now, let me then turn to a second challenge. My first challenge then is this accommodation of the drive towards deeper integration. But I think the evolution of the global economy has also, and in the 2000s, has also resulted in another challenge, which is accommodating the emerging powers. It used to be that we could run a trading system which provided, in effect, special and differential treatment for a group of countries who weren't all that significant, and most of the agreements, bite and heft, really was among the advanced countries. And so we had a dual-track system, and it was viable. But as changes occurred, so that China, for instance, became the world's largest trading nation, And as the BRICS emerged, so that what happened there could no longer be ignored, it has turned out, that this division of the world into developed and developing, which forms the basis of a lot of the rules of the multilateral trading system, simply no longer reflect reality. Now, it's interesting because, you know, people in the climate change area are often looking at the trade area with some jealousy because they say, well, you guys can enforce your agreements in trade, but we have trouble in climate. But exactly the same problem occurred in the climate change area, where the large emitters became too large not to be included in any type of agreement. And they reformed at Paris, and they came up with a formulation of special and differentiated treatment in which both developed and developing countries could participate, each in their own way. I believe that's the kind of change we need in the trading system. But absent that, I think we get impasse in the negotiations because it becomes impossible for those from the advanced countries to sign agreements, to come back to their parliaments or the Congress and to say, gee, we've got a great news for you. We just signed the Doha Development Agenda, and we've given special and differential treatment to large emerging economies who are your significant competitors. So we need reform. The minister mentioned the dispute settlement system, but I actually think the reforms we need go deeper than that. Let me see if I can get this to go. Now, we've seen this process of globalization, and we also heard the minister today talk about the backlash to globalization. And I want to show you a particular slide that I think explains really dramatically what has taken place in the United States. You know, there's a lot of discussion about the problem of income inequality. And indeed, growing income inequality is a problem in many, many countries. But there's too little discussion, for my taste, about the dangers of non-inclusive growth. When significant groups are not included in the growth process, the political ramifications can be considerable. Whether these be ethnic groups, whether there's be certain people of one gender versus another, or one level of education versus another. So here's a picture going back to 1970 of the real earnings of Americans, annual earnings in 2015 dollars. And what you'll see is that there's some remarkable differences. It's still true that college women are paid less than college men. And women without a college degree earn less than men without a college degree. That's, in a sense, the cross-section. But the time series is more powerful if you want to explain the last election in the United States and the emergence of Donald Trump in an economic way. You see, the non-college women and the college women have both seen about a 50% increase in their real incomes since 1970. The college men have seen, I guess, could we get the slide back? I'm sorry. Okay. The college men have seen something like a 40% increase, and then there are the non-college men. In 1970, a man without a college degree, the median male in the United States, earned $38,000 a year. In 2015, he, or maybe his son, the median male, was earning $40,000 a year. So non-college males have seen virtually no increase in their real incomes over a 50-year period. And they've also done panel data explorations where they find that this is true of men over their working careers. So it is important what we have now. Someone who is earning $40,000 a year is not poor. But to have seen no rise in your incomes for your whole working career, well, that's a real challenge to the American dream. And that's basically that each generation should live twice as well as the prior one. And that's what's happened in the United States. Okay, I guess I'm... Now, there's also a second really interesting development, and I owe this slide to David Autor from MIT, and that is that the structure of the labor market has changed. If you look at the bottom line, you'll see that's the real earnings, real hourly earnings of people in each decile. What you can see is that wages at the bottom have actually risen fairly rapidly. It's the wages in the middle that have not seen much increase, and wages at the top who have seen the fastest increase. So it's the plight, if you will, of those in the middle, particularly when it comes to changes, that I believe is very significant in understanding the politics in the United States. Can we change? Now, I think the decline in manufacturing employment in the US has played a significant role in both of these phenomena. In what's happened to the earnings of men without a college degree, and in the slow growth in the middle of the wage distribution. But I want to show you something quite remarkable. Basically, let's go back to 1961, and what you can see here is the share of employment in American manufacturing. Now, suppose, again, the dark red line, suppose it was 1981, and I'd asked you to project, tell me, what will be the share of manufacturing employment in the United States in 30 years' time? What you would have done is you would have fitted a trend line and then simply extrapolated it out. And what you see is you would have been exactly right. And I didn't mention automation. And I didn't mention globalization. And you didn't have to know about China's evolution. You would have been exactly right. So what is it that's causing this decline in the share of manufacturing employment? Well, it turns out that, by the way, this decline isn't just in the United States. What I show you here is the changes in percentage terms in countries throughout the developed world. And you can see they're all roughly around 14 or 15 percentage points. And it doesn't matter whether these are countries with significant surpluses in manufacturing, like Germany, or deficits, like the United States. Can we change? Could someone change the slides for me? Can you change? Okay. So what explains this? One is that productivity growth has been more rapid in goods than in services. Here I show you the data for productivity relative to GDP in the manufacturing sector in the United States. Now, what happens when productivity growth is rapid? Well, it turns out prices, and here just to confuse you, it's the inverse of the prices. This means when this line goes up, manufactured goods are getting cheaper. You can see that basically prices follow productivity growth. So while people have a debate, are the jobs disappearing because of trade, or are the jobs disappearing because of technology? They're missing the third part of the tripod, demand. Fast productivity growth can lead to more employment if demand responds to lower prices very elastically. But if demand is inelastic, you are going to see the loss of jobs. And it turns out that at the sectoral level, demand is inelastic. So people respond to cheaper goods by saying, gee, this is terrific. I've got more money to spend on services. So rapid productivity growth in goods is causing a rising demand for services. There's a second phenomenon. You can see here, this is the breakdown in people's spending on goods by quintile in the United States. And what you can see is everybody is spending a smaller share of their consumption on goods because their demand is inelastic. However, you also see poor people devote a higher proportion of their spending to goods than do rich people. You know, poor people, they need food, they need shoes, they need clothing, they need motorbikes. So these are all goods. Rich people, they need psychiatrists, they need tax accountants, they need personal trainers. These are all services. So as people have gotten richer, it has also turned out that the income demand elasticity has moved against goods and against manufacturing. And this is why the fundamental drivers that we saw pictured over the history of the United States for manufacturing jobs has basically been a negative. And this is why we see it in countries with both trade surpluses and with deficits. Yes, a trade surplus will give you a one-time benefit in more jobs if you run it in manufacturing. But over time, as productivity increases, the employment equivalent of that surplus will shrink. And so basically that's my story as to what's been happening in the US. I'm going to skip some of these and try to talk a little bit about the political ramifications of what we've seen. Basically, Donald Trump was one of the few politicians in the United States who picked up on these changes. And when people are in trouble, they looked for a narrative. And what Mr. Trump gave them was a narrative that, in effect, blames deindustrialization and the loss of manufacturing employment and the slow wage growth in manufacturing, not on technology combining with demand, but rather on bad trade agreements. And so his program has basically been designed, as he mentioned in his inaugural address, we will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. In fact, what we have, for the first time in living memory, is a protectionist American president. And you can go into the details of his trade strategy, but it seems to me that's fundamentally what we should recognize that we have. And whether it's national security as a pretext to raise tariffs on aluminum and steel, or whether it's intellectual property protection as a reason to put tariffs on China, or whether it's the desire to invoke safeguards on dishwashing machines. You give the administration an opportunity to raise tariffs, and that's what they're going to do. Because they have a belief, despite these global supply chains, despite what we know about the costs of trade protection, that this is going to be beneficial. It also turns out that their timing has been pretty good because there's a lot of strength in the US economy, and so we haven't really yet seen the full, while we see it industry by industry, in the aggregate, the US economy looks fine. Now, the particular policies that Trump has followed have been focused now, have become very heavily focused on China. And there is little question that China does present a major problem for the global trading system. On the one hand, the Chinese leadership says the right things. They say they're following a rules-based system. They're trying to promote free markets. They protect intellectual property. And they claim to treat foreign companies equally. But in fact, what we've seen, and it's not just American companies, but companies from Europe and companies from Japan, have increasingly experienced discrimination in the Chinese marketplace. And this is creating very, very significant tensions. And while you may not, most Americans would say we might not agree with Donald Trump's methods, but we certainly think there is some justification in his complaints. And I see the ball basically now in China's court. How will China respond to this? Will they evolve in a way that incorporates foreign firms in their industrial programs, in a way that starts to generate more favorable stories? Actually, there have been some moves in that direction. It seems to me that it is incompatible, as we look to the future, to have the world's largest trading country still have a market in which there is discriminatory behavior. You know, if we go back in history, we know that when Britain became the leader of the global economy, it unilaterally opened its markets at home in the Corn Act in the 1840s. That's not a coincidence, because only by having allies in the rest of the world who share in your economic growth does it become possible for a large trading nation to successfully exercise global leadership. So I think that's basically the challenge that the Chinese face. At the moment, I am quite pessimistic because I suspect that Donald Trump's motives in bringing up the intellectual property issue are not entirely pure. Indeed, they may well be a pretext for him to raise the tariffs on Chinese imports coming into the United States, many of which happen to be brought in by American and foreign companies. And if you go back and read his writings in 10, 15, or 20 years ago, you'll see his plans for imposing tariffs on Chinese imports. So I think what the president really wants is the war as opposed to the deal. But we can get into this further into the discussion. I want to, since I have too much to talk about, I want to briefly then skip some slides and point out to another feature of the environment that I think is very important. You know, when countries have grown, what we see is that the share of manufacturing employment increases as they start to develop, and then it declines. And I've spent some time, and the literature has spent some time, in trying to explain why is there this hump. And it turns out the hump comes from a surprising direction. It comes from agriculture. Rapid productivity growth in agriculture leads to cheaper food prices. People respond to rapid productivity growth and cheaper food prices by spending more of their money on goods and services. So during the phase in which a country is moving out of agriculture, there is a very strong positive benefit on industry. At the same time, within industry itself, there is this negative effect, which I've already described. Faster productivity growth leading to a greater demand in services. So there are these two forces. And during the initial phase, and that's why there's a hump, the positive force dominates. I believe that this is very significant for Indonesia today, because one place people are not looking as a way to enhance industrialization is more rapid productivity growth in agriculture. And I look at the Indonesian economy and I see huge structural differences in product and output differences in productivity. So I don't want to go away without leaving that message. There's a second thing that you'll notice, which is that today's emerging economies, here you can see Brazil and China, the BRIC countries, and South Africa, are having much greater difficulty in getting the same share of manufacturing employment as the early industrializers, like the United Kingdom and the United States. Why is that? Well, according to the research that I've been doing, it's because manufacturing productivity growth is being diffused rapidly around the world. So that even if you're a poor country today, you have access to much better technology than when the United Kingdom or the United States was at your stage of development. That means, and I've got slides that show that, the employment curve is shifting downward. The productivity of manufacturing is rising. The manufactured goods are getting cheaper over time at every given level of GDP. And the result is that the demand for workers in manufacturing is much weaker at any given level of productivity growth. And that's why I think latecomers have much greater challenges in industrializing than the early industrializers. There's a second change which is evident in the data, and that is that the demand for workers in manufacturing is becoming increasingly more skilled in nature. My colleague Danny Roderick did similar curves of employment relative to income, and what he found was that it was the low-skill employment demand which was diminishing considerably. And so I think, again, Indonesia is exactly on the right track in emphasizing the role of skills, because in today's industry, the kind of skills level and human capital levels that are required are significantly more demanding than in earlier time periods. So then we turn to a strange feature of our world, and that is that we have two groups of people who seem to have very strong convictions, not unusual for economists. You know, they say economists are often wrong but never in doubt. Well, there's one group of people who tell us that we're living in the fourth industrial revolution, and that there's a whole set of technologies that mean trouble. Basically, that developing countries are going to have much more difficulty in trading because 3D printing and robots can replace unskilled labor in a lot more areas than they used to be able to do. There are others who say that more broadly, the robots are going to lead to the replacement of routine workers. And we'll be talking a lot in this conference of artificial intelligence. And some will even point to the fact that the labor force participation rate in many countries is already falling. Well, those are, if you will, the techno-optimists. But then we also have, and some people say, have a universal basic income because these changes are going to be so dramatic. But then I note 2 points. The first is that this concern is not exactly new. Here's CNN Money in 2016. Smart robots could steal your job. Here's the New York Times in 1980. A robot is after your job. Here's the Wall Street Journal in 1960. Robots rise. Here's 1935. Thinking machines replace the thinker. And for those of you who know about the Luddites in the 1812s, by the way, the word sabotage comes from the French word for shoe is sabot. And these workers were throwing their shoes into the machines. And that's why it was known as sabotage. So these concerns are not new. Well, there's the argument this time is different. There's always the argument this time is different. But so far, there's another group of people who have actually, with great conviction, argued that we're living in a period of secular stagnation, that productivity is extraordinarily low, and certainly the data support this second view. So naturally the question, and Robert Gordon wrote this incredibly impressive book, which is called The Rise and Fall of American Growth, in which he argues that we've already felt the major impact of the internet, and that today's innovations are much less important than things like clean water, electricity, automobiles, much more revolutionary than the kind of changes we are looking at. Now, the data, as I've mentioned, are on the side of the stagnationists. And naturally, that raises the question of what exactly are people doing with the robots? Well, there are two ways to sort of reconcile these views. The first is that we're not measuring the productivity properly. There is some merit to that argument, but it's always been true that we've mismeasured productivity. So what you have to make is a case that we're increasingly inaccurate in our measures of productivity. And since something like 70% of all of the applications of these technologies are in intermediate production, it should show up in the final goods being cheaper, and we should be able to measure it. So I don't think the mismeasurement argument carries much weight. There's a second argument, though, which is it's still early. And I think at least that one has more credibility. There's a lot of talk about robots. So here's a slide from the venture capitalist Vinod Khosla. And what Khosla found was that in 2016, the United States was spending $11.3 billion on robotics. Sounds like quite a lot until you realize it was spending $66.3 billion on pet food. So you see, it's still small. And I got the most recent data. And the most recent data do show robotics spreading very rapidly. But the total amount of spending was $16.2 billion. So my take on this is it's still too early to tell. And in fact, the robots do have the potential for disruption in certain areas. But just like faster productivity growth in agriculture will create an increased demand for other kinds of products, If we can become more productive at producing some kinds of goods and carrying out some kind of tasks using our new technologies, there's going to be more money for people to spend on the services that cannot easily be replaced by the robots. So that's the optimistic view. You're not looking in the right place if you only look at the jobs that can be displaced. You have to ask what people are going to do with the income. So let me just very shortly, if I might, take 5 minutes and talk about some of the points I've made and just draw very briefly some implications for Indonesia. The first is that global growth prospects look mediocre. And in my view, what that means is that domestic and regional markets are more important, that Indonesia needs to stress those markets. It is already a leader in ASEAN, but ASEAN integration is very important, and ideally the kind of integration that doesn't only service global supply chains, but services each other's markets. So I think that's very important given the global environment. I also have already pointed to the need to stress agriculture, which I think has an important indirect effect on industry, but also in moving, since a third of the population is still in agriculture in Indonesia, moving people out of agriculture to other activities will generate very rapid growth. And I think you're not quite into the middle income trap yet, because you still have the early development phase to complete. Commodity markets look weak, and so I think it does stress diversification, makes diversification very important. The tariff wars, as people point out, do threaten global trade in general, but also offer opportunities for countries as the supply chains seek to relocate. And so it seems to me that Indonesia has an opportunity here. There already were opportunities because wages were rising in China and the supply chains were moving, but I don't see why more of them would not come here if your institutions and the logistics and the prerequisites are in place, and fewer than going to places like Cambodia and Myanmar. The fourth industrial revolution is going to present challenges, and everything points to the growing importance of skill and education. We cannot predict with great precision its effects, but we do know increasingly the people who can cope with these forces are those who are relatively better educated. That's what you saw in the US data, that's what I think you see around the world, and that's where a huge amount of the emphasis has to be. Finally, I would end up in saying, yes, these new technologies present challenges, but they also provide the opportunities of leapfrogging. The cell phone is the prime example. You could put a satellite in the air instead of laying down all the cables. There are just a multiplicity of ways in which a developing country today has opportunities to exploit technologies in ways that they didn't have in an earlier era. I want to thank you for your patience in putting up with me for so long. I want to apologize. I obviously had too much material on those slides. I offer them to the organizers, and if any of you would like copies so that you can go into greater detail, if you can still stand it, please ask them for those copies. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence, for a very, very interesting and stimulating presentation. I will now have some time for a few questions. I think we have about 20 minutes. I think that's right. The audience can participate through Slido, so please submit your questions for Professor Lawrence through Slido. But if I may take my prerogative as moderator to ask the first questions that we can start the discussion. can services, you mentioned about how, a lot of the demand is shifting to services as the prices of agriculture and manufacturing go down, and then people end up consuming more and more services. And technology has also been making services more and more tradable. So can services play some of the role that manufacturing did for some of the industrializing East Asia in the 70s and 80s? Is development in the 2000s and 2010s possible through services trade?
Well, we do have sort of the example of India. We do have countries that have been able to export services. After all, tourism, as we sit in Bali, is a major export. But I think we shouldn't be looking, so while there are parallels with manufacturing, and we can learn that kind of model, I think we should also be asking, how can we exploit these new technologies in order to make our services more productive? But that's more of a domestic challenge than an international one. Actually, countries have done much better in adapting technologies for manufacturing from elsewhere than they have for adapting technologies for services. And I see that as the big challenge. So that enhancing growth through services by exploiting the potential of what are, after all, information technologies. But there will remain sectors, fortunately perhaps, in which personal services are very important, in which person-to-person contact is very important, and where people value that contact, and there are many skills associated with those types of services. That's another area, I think, that is very important for future growth.
Thank you. So maybe moderator services one day will be automated, and the future AIFED 9th conference will be a robot moderating the session. Do we have the slide of questions from the audience? Or do we have members from the audience who want to ask a question the old-styled way with the microphone? I think we have a very shy crowd. Okay, the questions have come up. There we go. So given currently the skill level of Indonesian labor force is still low, is leapfrogging still a feasible strategy? Or if I may put it differently, I mean, given the current skill levels, what are some of the opportunities for leapfrogging, given that you also have a skills challenge to meet?
Well, I think, there are a vast array of technologies, and some allow people, even when they don't have high skills, to perform their jobs better. When I go to check out at McDonald's today, the people can simply push a few buttons and it will add up my bill. In the old days, they would take out a piece of paper and there would be a carbon copy and they would have to engage in addition. So that's just one example. There are many, many tasks, it seems to me, that can actually supplement and enhance people who don't have all of the skills. So it's complicated. Some people will find that their skills can be automated, but others will find that what they do can be enhanced. One of the classic examples, actually, now I wouldn't want to call bank tellers unskilled, but there was this remarkable experience we had when ATMs started to come in. You might have expected that employment opportunities for bank tellers would decline. But what we actually see in the data was that they rose, because banks took advantage of the fact that they could now have ATMs to open many more branches. And they also got the tellers to perform different kinds of services. So we evolved with the technologies, and there are incentives to use the people we have. And so I would say it's hard to predict, but there is a way in which even people who don't have high skills or have college educations can find that they are made more productive by these technologies.
So I will combine two questions that I saw. One of them was whether industrialization is still a viable strategy for Indonesia. And you actually had in your presentation something that yes, but with less inclusion than before. And the other one, which is related to that, is that whether labor-intensive strategies are still viable for Indonesia. So maybe if you can take those two questions and think about manufacturing and how can you make that still inclusive if manufacturing is still an option and industrialization is still an option for Indonesia.
I think, by the way, I didn't have the opportunity to show you, but it is very interesting. Most people believe that the development process involves agriculture, then manufacturing, and then services. But that is not right in the data. The share of services in the economy when it is industrializing is higher than the share of manufacturing. So continuously, services play a key role. And while I do think there are opportunities for industrialization in Indonesia, you have a huge domestic market. And so servicing that domestic market as people get wealthier and a middle class grows larger is a huge opportunity for the production of goods. But it is also an opportunity for services to be provided and also to create employment. And then it comes to international trade. I still think, for all the talk so far, I guess they call it the sewbot, the robot that's going to be able to sew a suit and displace a worker. Well, sewing a suit turns out to be a very complicated exercise. Now, maybe at some time down the road, that process will be automated. But I think for the foreseeable future, there is still a lot of scope for labor-intensive activities in industry. And again, I make this distinction between some of the tasks that can be automated and other tasks that require a human touch. And so I see more stress on those, but I don't think that Indonesia should be ruling itself out of exporting manufactured products. I think by investing in logistics, by improving the administration of ports, customs, by lowering corruption, by making this a more attractive location for foreign investment, foreign investors who will naturally bring technologies. You don't necessarily have to force them to do so. All of these could provide opportunities for exports from Indonesia, both to the rest of ASEAN and to the rest of the world.
Thank you. So I think that we had a question also on agriculture. And maybe if you can speak a little bit, since you were emphasizing the importance of increasing productivity in agriculture, what are some of the successful strategies that countries have used to actually develop their agriculture, increase productivity, and how that supports manufacturing?
Well, I'm not an expert on agriculture. There are some people in this room who know a lot more about it than I do, and it is also very country-specific. But my view of why India was growing at the Hindu growth rate of around 3% a year in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then suddenly took off. And I think the Green Revolution had a lot to do with it. I think the adoption of new technologies in agriculture allowed for the generation of surplus income that in turn generated demand for goods. So I can't in one sentence tell you how to improve agriculture in Indonesia. I don't know if I had more time I'd be able to do better, but I do believe that that's getting in the discussions that I read about constraints to growth and so on in Indonesia. I think far too little attention is being placed on agriculture, and that's why I wanted to make it a point of emphasis.
Thank you. So do we have more questions? Do we have any Conference 3.0 questions from the audience? Or are we only doing slide 100%? It's fully automated, the questions. So I think that's a very good question. In terms of thinking about the losers from technology or trade, what are some of the social protection policies that you think could be successful that governments could look at, or some of the reskilling policies so that you can compensate the losers, or you can come up with fewer losers from global trade and technology changes?
Now, I think this isn't an easy question to answer for all countries. Again, some of the solutions have to be country-specific. In the United States, we have had a special program for trade adjustment assistance. I actually believe that while it was worthwhile, it was too limited. In today's world, people are dislocated for reasons beyond their control across a wider range of activities. And technology and corporate strategies are bigger disruptors than international trade. So I favor more broader-based labor market policies than simply trying to isolate those who are losers from one source of change. Nonetheless, it seems to me that we do have to have mechanisms, and they're a variety. The first key one relates to the transition of people from school to work. And this is something we know that in Germany and elsewhere, in Austria, they do very well through apprenticeship systems. In many other countries around the world, there are very high youth unemployment rates because the youth are not being effectively integrated. The transition from school to work is weak. And so that's a point which I think is essential. A second relates to training of workers continuously, because as the technologies develop, new skills are going to be required. And so that requires enhanced opportunities in that respect. And then there's the third group where what your question asked about, which relates to social protection, where, in a sense, people are aged or they have difficulty in finding work. Those people may need assistance. But I am much more enthusiastic about measures which supplement the incomes of those who actually do work, things like what we call a negative income tax, than measures that simply pay people regardless of whether they work or not. I think the incentive systems that lead people to invest in themselves, to give them a sense of purpose in their lives, can be dulled when you simply give people money. That's why I don't view a universal basic income favorably. But nonetheless, if it turns out that the machines do get so productive that the earnings are not regarded as sufficient, that's where I think the tax and transfer system should be brought into play.
Sorry, before I see the next question, what kind of taxation system do you envision to pay for some of these negative income tax or some of this tax and transfer?
Well, we have seen a very paradoxical development, certainly in my country and in many others. We've seen the rich getting richer. We've seen growing income inequality. At the same time, what we've seen is a movement to bring down taxes. So I think there is no substitute, if you want to have some redistribution, to have more equitable tax systems, and in effect to tax some of those who are wealthier. So I think a movement in the direct, I am much more in favor of taxing rich people than in taxing corporations, although I'm aware that people can shift their income between those two sources. But nonetheless, I do think there is no escaping the fact that if we are going to have faster productivity and we're going to have higher incomes, and these are going to have negative effects, we need to think hard about how we redistribute some of the gains that are accruing to the winners to those who are made worse off.
So there's a question that mentions that higher educated labor in Indonesia, I assume that must be tertiary educated, is only about 3%, according to the statistics in 2016. And given the fact that the labor force is actually aging, what are some of the tools that a country like Indonesia has to be able to leverage this kind of complementary, highly skilled talent that would be necessary to take advantage of the new technologies?
Well, there is no question that it's very challenging, and I think it's very interesting. It's very challenging for people who are middle-aged and who are older, who didn't have the opportunity to go to college, now to adapt to a changing environment. And I think this is one of the reasons why, if you look at the votes, let's say, on Brexit, or you look at the votes, who's voting in favor of Hillary Clinton, say, versus Donald Trump, what you see is a very strong age component, because it is very difficult for people who are older to adjust to a changing world. And so one part of this is to compensate them, to try to, with some forms of social dividends. Another is to try to change them. But at the end of the day, it's very tough, because we're living in a changing world. And I think that's why younger people have much greater flexibility, and it is vital, as the purpose of our meeting, which is to look over the next 15, 20 years, we have to think about what are we doing to equip the young to face the challenges that they're likely to face.
Thank you. I think that I will, again, use my prerogative to ask what I guess is the last question. Let's try to help the organizers to keep the conference running more or less on time. With respect to industrial policy, what are your views in terms of active industrial policies? Should Indonesia actually be considering providing, whether it's incentives or other kinds of targeted assistance to specific manufacturing industries or to the manufacturing sector more broadly, or high knowledge services? What are your views on activist industrial policy?
Well, my view is that there is a role for government in economic development. But the major emphasis should be on doing things that firms cannot do for themselves, not on replicating or doing things which a private firm ought to be accomplishing. There are a huge number of public goods that need to be provided for industry to thrive, whether it's in the regulatory area, whether it's in the skills development area, whether it's in providing infrastructure, whether it's in the providing honest and efficient administration. All of these or research. All of these are public goods. And that's where I think the emphasis of the government ought to be. Nonetheless, there can be cases, if they're clearly understood, where the government can also try to stimulate hubs and experimentation. The Chinese have done this quite successfully in several cases involving artificial intelligence, for instance, where the government can act as an integrator, so by establishing networks. So I think modern industrial policy is much more subtle than the old-fashioned one, which said, let's give a subsidy or let's give a tariff. It requires a skill of thinking about where are the holes in the private system where the government can play a role in facilitating an ecosystem that's going to stimulate entrepreneurship and innovation.
Thank you very much. I think that we are ending up right on time. Please, let's give a big round of applause to Professor Lawrence.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to please Professor Lawrence and also Mr. Sander, please remain on stage to receive the token of appreciations. Also, I would like to invite Dr. Singgih Rifat as the Professor Research Fiscal Policy Agency to give the token of appreciation. Kami persilakan. Ladies and gentlemen, give a round of big applause. And once again, thank you to Professor Lawrence and also Mr. Federico Gilsander from World Bank. Thank you very much. I would like to please you to be seated. Thank you.